Omaha. Welcome into another episode of Restaurant Hoppen. I'm your host, Dan Hoppen, and great Cajun cuisine is not something that's necessarily easy to find in the middle of the country. I mean, in a city like Omaha, where we have all kinds of places for Italian food and burgers and steaks, you're not going to find a lot of etouffee and jambalaya and muffaletta sandwiches. Thankfully, we have people like my guest today. He and his family have brought Cajun cuisine to Omaha, and they are doing it right. This is Justin Halbert. He's the owner, one of the owners of Herbe Sainte in Exarban. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So, just in case somebody is hearing about Herbe Sainte for the first time or they haven't been there before, how would you describe it to somebody? What's the concept?
Yeah, so when we first started the concept for Herbe Sainte, we definitely were trying to focus on the cocktail aspect of New Orleans. So we wanted it to feel like a place that you could come and enjoy cocktails, have a light bite to eat, but we wanted to represent that cocktail culture. Over time, Herbe Sainte, the menu grew basically through demand. Sorry, I'm forgetting the word. We were reviewed for our restaurant about month 3. So it was in January of 2017 that we would have had our first review. And when we were reviewed, it was as if we were a restaurant. And so the plans quickly changed from, we're a cocktail bar with a little bit of food. We sold out of all of our food in the entire building that first Friday night that we were reviewed. And so we had to go and find ways to get food back in the building on Saturday. The following Monday, we went back to our landlords and said, hey, we need more space because we didn't even have enough cooler space or anything. So we had to expand and add more coolers, add a freezer so that we could actually keep up with the demand. And ever since, we've expanded that food offering. And what we've tried to do with the food is just represent, some of the cuisines like you talked about, etouffee, jambalaya, muffaletta. But then every time we go down, myself and my wife or any of our staff, if we find a food offering that we're really interested in, we have expanded that and added it to the menu. So now, we've got things like the meatball fricassee, which is something that my wife and I found down there. My uncle has always been really passionate about like collard greens and red beans and rice. And those are two of our big sides that we offer that we make in-house. Everything we make is from scratch, 3 different types of roux. We try to be really as authentic as we can be. Like you said, you're maybe not finding a ton of Cajun Creole in the Midwest, but really, what it comes down to is finding your niche, finding what you want to do, and then sticking with, classic recipes. For many years when we were working, we had a guy that's a friend of all of ours working with us. His name is Jeff Hebert. And as you can hear, his name is he would say Kunas is a people that are down there. And so he really helped us with a lot of those recipes and making sure that they're authentic. And so, yeah, to this day, we try to offer a little bit of both, that food and cocktail. And I think it works really well. It's a very, I would say laid back experience. A lot of people come in expecting a restaurant. They expect a host at the front door, and we're a bar that sells food. And that's how we've always looked at it, is that we're a cocktail bar that happens to sell food, and we sell a lot of food. So
what defines Cajun cuisine for you? Like, what's the ethos of that cuisine?
Cajun Creole is such an interesting cuisine, and I would say as American food goes, it's just like anything else. It's kind of stealing from other cultures. Let's not say stealing, let's say representing and making it our own in a sense. Cajun Creole cuisine really combines so many different cultures that it's got French, it has the Caribbean islands, it has the African influence, obviously. And so I think really what it comes down to is it's kind of, similar if we talk about like, Southern food in general, where it's comfort food, it's really still in that same vein, and then just add a bunch of different spice and different ingredients. So that's where you get the spiciness of it. You get the different, like, for instance, okra that you use a lot of times in Cajun Creole. That's an African plant that was brought over and used, by slaves. And so there are a lot of these influences that come through the different cultural amalgamation of that area between the French, the Caribbean, and also Spanish, their Spanish influence. So I think that's really, to me and to what we want to represent, is just the different diversity of flavors and ideas of Cajun Creole. So
now, I think there are a lot of people in not only Omaha, but in America who are vaguely aware of what Cajun cuisine is. They see what goes on during Mardi Gras. They have seen pictures of etouffee or whatever, but they haven't had that legit experience. And so, if you serve them decent Cajun food, they're like, hey, this is pretty good.
Right.
But that's not what you guys wanted to do. In fact, I found a quote from you a while ago. You said you didn't want to create a place in Omaha that feels like a kitschy northern version of Mardi Gras. We wanted to make it feel like New Orleans is, not what the rest of the country thinks New Orleans is. We wanted to find some fun and interesting food items that you don't see outside of New Orleans.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that? And what are some examples of that?
No, and that's, I think, first and foremost, when we're talking about that kitschy representation, is so many places in the North focus on Mardi Gras.
Yep.
And Mardi Gras is definitely culturally a big deal down there, no doubt. But it's about a 2-month span that they go through different processions up to Mardi Gras, and it's a small portion of what they do. So when you go to New Orleans, and anytime other than Mardi Gras, when you go there, it's a very vibrant community of people. It's not just tourists coming in trying to party and have fun and enjoy Mardi Gras. There is such a vibrant community of people that are all living and working, and yes, a lot of it is focused on tourism. But if you go to different neighborhoods or different areas in Louisiana, you start to see that there's etouffee everywhere, right? But etouffee looks completely different everywhere. And that's because each grandmother or each family has their own recipe, and they do it slightly differently. The different areas might have different cultural backgrounds. Some may be more French, some may be more Creole. So it's one of those that there may be different cooking styles that vary. And so really for us, when you walk into Herbe Sainte, we didn't want it to be like Mardi Gras threw up all over Herbe Sainte. So when you walk in, we do have some little placements of beads that have stuck around, but it almost looks like when you're in New Orleans and there's just random beads hanging on, a balcony somewhere. Like it happened at some point, but it's not the only thing you see. The purple, gold, and green, that's a big one during the Mardi Gras celebration, or the different colors. And you'll find little bits and pieces of it, but it's not like it's draped in your face everywhere. The other thing that we did with the decor at Herbe Sainte, and this, we had a designer help us with a couple of items, but really Herbe Sainte was created by myself, my brother, and my uncle and I. And so when you come into Herbe Sainte, we can go through and tell you, well, I thought of that, and my uncle thought of that. And really what we wanted to do was we wanted to make Herbe Sainte feel as if it had been there longer than it had, because it is a new build-out building. It was a brand new, fresh space when we got in there. So, for instance, one of the things we did intentionally was leave the beams above us that were rusted out. We left them rusty. And then we also added other elements of rust in the space. So if you look behind the bar on the left-hand side, there's our boxes that are meant to be kind of like your mom's curio cabinet. Lots of little things. In the curio cabinet, we have gone down several times. We have voodoo dolls. We've got my dad's great-grandfather's apothecary license from Iowa. He was a pharmacist. So we have his apothecary license. We have all these kind of, little things that mean stuff to us from travels or whatever it may be. But then behind it, there are these panels. And when we got them, they were big sheets of stainless steel. Me and the builder, we sat down and we dumped Coca-Cola over them, and we rusted it all out so that we could match that aesthetic and bring that vibe of it being there for longer than it had. So again, just saying, that idea of it not being a kitschy representation, we wanted it to be comfortable, relaxed, a place that could feel like it could be in New Orleans rather than a place that's trying to, mimic New Orleans somewhere else. So
I find that just so fascinating, the idea of instantly aging a restaurant,
right.
But that's what you wanted to do.
We wanted it to feel older and more worn in, because you go to New Orleans, and some of those establishments have been open for hundreds of years. You can still go to the old Absinthe House, and it's been there for forever. And, walking through the history of it, and Omaha has its history too, with, the old market and everything. And I think it's one of those, but, Exarban Village not being in a historical neighborhood, it's newer. We wanted to do something to make it feel more historical.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask you about this later, but we're here, so let's just go there now. The layout of the space is just so interesting because you can eat in Herbe Sainte as if you want it to be a traditional restaurant. Yep, there are tables. You can eat like that. You can sit out on the patio. There's patio seating, but then there's also there's bar seating where kind of like you mentioned, it looks like these are seats where somebody's been putting their butt for 25 years, not, 7 or 8 years. And then you guys just have like couches and like furniture seating and stuff out in your restaurant. What was kind of the thinking behind that? What does that bring to the restaurant?
Well, so when we started with the concept of it being a bar, a cocktail bar, it was, we don't want it to feel like a stuffy restaurant. And most times when you walk into a restaurant, the bar, for instance, you mentioned that, feels like an afterthought. It feels like something they have to have, but not something that's utilized. Where at Herbe Sainte, when you walk in, the bar is the focus, right? It's that whole back wall. It's kind of that, when we get people like travelers, we get a ton of people from the hotels that are just walking. They don't really know what the neighborhood's about. We have 2 hotels coming from the north. So they're walking south into the neighborhood and they pass by and you watch them all the time. They crane their neck, they see the big giant bar and they turn right back around and come in the door. And so we wanted that bar to be the focal point and the showstopper of Herbe Sainte. And then from there, it's kind of build your way down. So from the bar and the bar seating, then you have the high top table. So it feels and kind of mimics that bar feel. So that gets really lively. It has people up higher. So it kind of keeps that energy up and elevated. And then the rest of the restaurant is lower seating, just like you would have in a traditional restaurant. The couches have always been something that that was our mix in that bar cocktail. Somewhere that's comfy, that you can sit down. You don't feel like you have to go anywhere anytime soon. And this is one thing we stress to people constantly is you don't have to feel like you're on a timeline at Herbe Sainte. So many restaurants you go in and you're so worried about, well, I got to get out of here because they need to turn the tables. And that's never been the case, and it never will be the case at Herbe Sainte. We want people to feel like they can come in and have 2 cocktails, 3 cocktails, whatever it may be. If they want food, great. If they don't, absolutely great. And, so it's that vibe of like, you make the experience what you want to be. Maybe on a Monday, you just want a cocktail experience into Herbe Sainte. Thursday, maybe you're looking for a dinner with your wife. Cool. Come out, and Herbe Sainte can do that again, and you can have just a different experience, in our space. The couches, though, have been one of those things where, business people will look at me, well, you could get a lot more turns if you put, more tables and this, that, and the other. And my response is always, but then at a certain point, we're losing what we are and who we are. And what we are and who we are is comfortable and relaxed, and we want people to feel that in our space. And the nice thing with the couches is, we get big parties every single week wanting to book them up. We can put 15 to 20 people in that area. And so people will come and they'll all sit and enjoy and stand up and converse and walk around. And, if families come in with their little kid, I always tell them, it might be more comfortable if you're on the couches, because little kids are used to eating at a couch, not sitting at a table in a restaurant. So a lot of times they'll go over and just a couple with their little child will dine on the couches because it's easier and the kid can play on the couches and it's very comfortable for them. So really, it's just one of those things for so many reasons. We love the couches. And it just feels comfortable and inviting when you walk in to see that almost like living room setting,
I'm so fascinated by the idea that this was never intended to be a restaurant, and that it was cocktails and it was small bites, because your food is really so good, and I want to get into the development of that. But I want to go back to the original concept. No. What interested you and your brother and your uncle in opening not only a bar, but one that focused specifically on that New Orleans theme and bringing New Orleans cocktails in?
I think so. When we first opened in 2016, not to say that cocktail bars were new, but there was like a resurgence or like an uptick in cocktail bars at that time. So for instance, Night Owl had just opened about a year earlier. Mercury opened about the same exact time that we did, and so it was like even in Omaha, but around the country, there was this kind of upswell of cocktail bars in that concept. So when we were looking at that, it was like, well, thematically, if you look at them, a lot of them rely heavily on classic cocktails, which generally tend towards New York style. So Manhattans, old fashions, whiskey style, Kentucky, this, that, and the other. And so just thinking about, well, what can we do different to differentiate ourselves? And if you look at America, and it's like, well, where are the cocktail cultures? And I just named like the 3 big ones, right? Kentucky, New York, and then New Orleans. And so we really settled on that, with that idea in mind of just that cocktail culture, the upbeat, so many different influences. thinking about the food too, my uncle had cooked in a Cajun Creole restaurant in his younger life. And so he did bring some of that experience of, hey, I can come up with some of these recipes that we can utilize for Herbe Sainte. And then my brother and I and my wife helped create it too. At the time, when we sat down and started looking at menus, it's kind of like, okay, well, let's find the cocktails that are representative of New Orleans. And so we went in and you start looking and it's just, there's so many. And so we settled on, 8 cocktails that never change. So our menu, the top 8 cocktails are always the same. And that's the Hurricanes, it's the Sazeracs, it's the Corpse Revivers, it's all of these different cocktails that generally are going to have, absinthe is one common theme. You're also going to have rum as a common theme in a lot of things, but then gin too, because you have that French influence. So there is that kind of mix of the cultures. And then, we always wanted to have a mix of seasonal cocktails. So twice a year, our seasonal cocktails change. And that's where we allow our staff to have a big influence. And so allowing the staff to be creative, allowing them to bring all of their ideas. We all sit together, twice a year, and we all pick apart everybody's cocktails. And I always tell people, if you think that your first iteration of a cocktail is going to make the menu, you need to readjust the thinking, because we're all going to sit down and say, what can we do to make this the perfect cocktail to add to the menu? So it's a really fun, upbeat, vibrant cocktail menu that's ever changing, but again, still has that, the 1 foot in New Orleans with those 8 cocktails.
So obviously the cocktail's still a big part of the menu. And like you said, there are many, many people that will come into Herbe Sainte and just order small bites or not order food at all and treat it as a bar.
Yep.
But there was, that review, I'm assuming that was by the World Herald.
Yeah.
Caused a bit of an earthquake, and it kind of had to change your business model on the fly.
Yeah.
What was that like for you guys? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but go into that deeper, because that's something that, I mean, you would have to reshape, redevelop the menu, redevelop the space. Everything about your concept all of a sudden shifts.
Right.
Like, in an instant.
And it was literally in an instant, because we got it on a Thursday. The reviews used to come out on Thursdays. And on Friday, obviously, we start getting blown up, and we're on a wait. Friday night, I think our wait started at 4:30, and it didn't end until 9:30, and it was like 40 people deep for 5 hours. Jeez. It was nuts. And so, it changed a lot of things for us. One, like you talked about and I brought up earlier, is the actual physical space. So we started, and it's a very tight, small space. Everything is very intentional. Our joke in our company is that we use every cubic inch of our space, because we actually have things that you don't see as guests that are stacked up into the rafters. We have a whole storage unit above our bathrooms. So we've got stuff stored up, and we have ladders to get to them. I mean, it's definitely an operation to just store the things that we need. So when that happened and we blew through all of our food, all we have is a couple of reach-in coolers. We didn't have a walk-in cooler. And we actually went 6, almost 7 years without a walk-in cooler. So that's saying something, and basically then, so we were lucky enough that out our back door, the one that you can see right by the bar, there's another small space. And if you catch a glimpse as it opens now, you'll see it's an enclosed space. Well, at that time, it wasn't enclosed. So we were able to go to our landlord and put up another wall behind our space. So we have a demising wall that basically cuts us off from the back hallway. And we were able to add some more storage space. So we added another 2-door stand-up cooler, another taller freezer, some more dry storage space to keep, goods that we need for the restaurant. And so right then and there it was how do we accommodate, how much food we're actually going to have to produce. Because we always intended for our sales mix to be way heavier cocktails than it was food. And now, like the last few years, food has surpassed cocktails, not because cocktails have fallen off. It's just simply because the food aspect keeps growing. And so, I mean, it's a great problem to have. So then coming out of the pandemic and, we had, obviously 2020 and 2021 were really tough years for everybody. But 2022 and 2023 were gangbusters for a lot of people. So it was a big uptick. And in that time, I was able to convince my landlord to give me another space in the way, way back of the building that we were able to put a walk-in cooler. So we're finally at the point where we're like a real restaurant. We've got a walk-in cooler. We've got a little bit extra space to spread out, And then my joke becomes, you give everybody extra space, and now it's like we feel like we don't have enough space again. It's always that game of playing around with that. So, but yeah, it definitely shifted us. The other thing, to bring up too is just the way that we seat people. So many restaurants work off of a reservation system, and we have always steadfast with our system of not taking small reservations. We do take larger reservations because it's better to know that we've got 8 people coming in, or, we start at 5 just because 5, we have to start pulling tables together to make it work. So, we take these 5 and up reservations so that we can plot those in. But beyond that, with 2s and 4s, we ask people to join our wait list. So any given night of the week, if you go on our website, you can join our wait list. If there is no wait list, it means come on in. We're available. But it's one of those things that what people, they think that they're not going to be able to find a spot. But what we do, and what I think is so effective about having a small space and not running reservations, is that we're not holding tables. So like a bigger restaurant, it's much larger than ours. They have the luxury of holding tables aside for reservations and still being able to accommodate people walking in. But with such a small space, we really don't have that luxury to hold a bunch of tables aside waiting for somebody to come in. So what we do is basically, if you're walking in the door, your butt's down, right? And then somebody gets up and somebody else gets down. So we're constantly keeping the tables full. So it's a little bit different than a typical restaurant. And honestly, for 2s and 4s, we really don't, I would say the longest waits would be right in the heat of brunch or right in the heat of a Friday, Saturday night. Yeah, you might have to wait an hour. But that's pretty typical. You go to anywhere on a Friday night at 6 o'clock without a reservation, and you're going to wait for an hour or so, right? But if you're trying to make an event, I know it can be stressful. So we always just tell people, join that wait list. And honestly, we get people in 20 minutes max, 9 times out of 10. So, I think people, once they get used to that, it's a little different than most restaurants. They start to understand the flow. Maybe they come a little bit earlier so that they know they're missing that rush. They get on our wait list. They know the tricks to get themselves in and out pretty quickly. So, we deal with a lot of events because of being in Exarban. We have concerts that go on. The hockey games are the big thing for us, during the wintertime, where we have a lot of people coming into the neighborhood. And I think people start to get used to it. The regulars that are going to hockey games know they can get into Herbe Sainte at 4:30, 5 o'clock. They can be out by 7 and to the game, and they can make it really easy. So
now talk to me about the menu development, because I know you said that your uncle, Ron Samuelson, he had some experience cooking Cajun food, but it's one thing to be planning on having a menu where we're going to have some small bites to, all of a sudden we need like a full entree menu. Yeah. We're going to need appetizers. Do we need to offer desserts here? Like, to have to make menu development takes months and months, sometimes years, to have to make that shift that quickly. I cannot even imagine what that was like. How did you guys pivot the menu in that short time?
Yeah, I would say we were very lucky at the time. We had one of our great friends, and still to this day, and our chef at the time, his name was Jeff Owen. Jeff only left us for health issues for himself, which was, we're glad he's doing better and all of that, but we always miss him every day. And so Jeff was a big part of our menu, and he had a lot of those items kind of at his ready. He had things that we were able to add in and expand the menu. And I think too, then beyond that, like you said, it was just this collaboration of what do we need to see expanded? What do we want to add? It was more research and development, just kind of over the years to expand that menu and find different items to offer. Yeah, I would say, it was a lot, kind of like a team effort of just how do we expand this in a way that we can, do this effectively and efficiently, especially in a small kitchen. We have a tiny kitchen. We have no fryers. So that's one thing, like we don't do fried po' boys. You'll get people constantly come in and, do you have a shrimp po' boy? Well, we kind of have a shrimp, sandwich. Roll, we have the shrimp roll, and that's just our way of throwing homage to the shrimp, fried shrimp po' boys that we can't do because we don't have fryers. And so it's this really interesting mix of finding a recipe and then how do we make it really fast and efficient in our space and make sure that we can handle the volume and it's not a long item to cook. So there's a lot of preparation ahead of time. And I think that kind of mixes with how Cajun Creole cuisine is anyways. It's a lot of prep, between roux. Roux can take 3 hours to make. I mean, it's not an easy process. And so I think it's one of those things that Cajun Creole cuisine lends to that of, being very thoughtful in the creation of recipes and menus and things like that so that we can execute them really well. But yeah, I mean, over the years then you just start to find different items that we want to add in. Like I mentioned, the meatball fricassee, but even something that's not very Cajun Creole, like the mac and cheese was something that Jeff Owen did, just on a whim. He did a special and people loved it. And we're like, well, that'd be a good one to fill out the menu a little bit, having Cajun mac and cheese. And it's got andouille in it and it has kind of a spicier cheese sauce that we make. So it's not your typical mac and cheese, but again, just kind of, this is our menu at the end of the day and let's expand it with things that people enjoy and are fun. So
I'm struggling a little bit to think of the word that I want to use in this question. The one that's coming to my mind is disappointing, and I know that that's not the right word because every restaurateur, they have a concept in their head. They have a thing that they want to do originally, and then based off of how the public receives it or, what people ask of it, that concept is going to shift over time. You guys' concept shifted dramatically. Your idea was we're going to have this New Orleans-themed bar or that's going to offer these specific cocktails. We're really excited about that. And now I would say most people, if you ask them, what's Herbe Sainte, they'd say it's a Cajun restaurant in Exarban. Wildly different things. So I don't think the word disappointing is right, but what is your emotion when you think about that original concept? Do you have to mourn that a little bit and be like, that would have been so cool if we could have had that? Or is it more embracing what you have and being like, this isn't what we intended, but I'm so excited that we have this?
I would say the latter, definitely.
Okay.
And it's one of those things that, our company in general, we talk about this frequently. We talk about this, and I mentioned it with cocktail creation. We never put so much ego into something that if it changes or the guest perceives it differently or your peers receive it differently, we never have so much ego in it that we get deflated because of it. So we talk about this with everyone, and I think it probably started exactly where you're talking about is if my ego made me say this is exactly what Herbe Sainte is, but that's not what the public wanted, I may not be here today with Herbe Sainte. And so the public really, we're here to serve the public at the end of the day. And so, we all talk about we have a servant's heart, and having a servant's heart means allowing people to kind of dictate which path you're taking. So then in doing that and taking that ego out, you're able to just sit back and say, well, it's not exactly what I intended, but it still is 95% of what I intended. It's still a cocktail bar. It's still a place where you can come and get a great cocktail. It's still a vibrant, fun place. And the food just adds to all of that. So to me, it's almost expanded in a sense beyond what I had intended in probably the best way possible. Now, if if your concept gets taken and hijacked in a way that you're not comfortable with, I think that'd be totally different. But clearly, we're restaurateurs. We do this, in different areas and concepts. So I think at the end of the day, the fact that it's done that to us, I think we're more proud than anything that the guests saw something in our food, that they wanted more from us from the food. And so having that opportunity to expand that menu, I would say has been a great thing. I would say, year 8, the thing that we're looking at now is, we've been open 8 years, probably, with the majority of these items since probably, for the last 7 years. So now it's like, well, how do we start mixing it up a little bit without rocking the boat? Because now there's a little bit of that. Have we settled into a pattern, right? So how do we take items? Do we get rid of certain items? And does the public freak out if we take something off? I don't know. So we're at that point of creativity where we're looking at all those possibilities. So I think you just look at it for the most positive way of how can we have fun with this concept and how can we expand and have fun and make sure that people are receiving it well. So I wouldn't call it disappointing at all. I'd say, Herbe Sainte is still my baby, my wife, my uncle, my brother. It's still our baby. It's one of those things that we love everything about it, and anything that we can do to further that or make it better or improve it, I think we're all interested and excited to do it. So
I think that that's so smart, and I think it's something that a lot of restaurants or any concept, a bar too, really struggles with, is trying to determine what are our cornerstones, what are the things that we're going to build our concept on and that cannot change, versus what are the things that we can adapt when the public says, I want to see this or I want more of this. Your cornerstone is, we're going to offer these New Orleans cocktails. We're going to have our standard 8. We're going to have our seasonal ones that we come up with a couple times a year. That is always going to be a huge part of this concept.
Yep.
But now it turns out people really want Cajun food to go along with that. We can adapt and we can bend to that, and we can grab as much space in this building as we can over time to add more and more. I think that was just so smart to be able to adapt a little bit and to be able to pivot and not just say, nope, this is a bar. We don't care what that review said. We don't. People will adjust back.
You see that in certain businesses.
Sure.
And I'm surprised sometimes to see it, because I think it does. I get you have a concept, but at the same time, I think the public is still here to pay your bills. And so allowing a little bit of that influence. Now, that being said, I'll give you one funny example of the public steering us a certain way, and we had to adjust over time differently than I think the public was telling us. And so very early on, boils were a big thing. And it's kind of fallen off a little bit.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think those were gaining in popularity about 8 years ago at the same time that the cocktail movement was gaining. So people kept telling us, well, you got to do boils. And hey, we're happy to do it. We had a lot of fun. We're talking about reviving some of those boils this fall again. We haven't done them in a couple years since before the pandemic. I think it's just been one of those things that we had to focus on certain things coming out of the pandemic, and that was one that got left to the side for the time being. So we're talking about reviving those. But when we first, when they were first gaining in popularity, everybody kept saying crawfish boils. We want crawfish boils. And so I think the first crawfish boil, I want to say I ordered in like 150 pounds of live crawfish for us to cook and have just a crawfish boil. And what we found is that the general public doesn't actually want crawfish boils. They don't know how to eat crawfish. 9 times out of 10, they're looking at it like, what do I do with this thing? So I spend my entire shift walking around just showing people how to open crawfish and eat it. And we ended up having a lot left over. So we ended up having to basically cook them all off and use that for etouffee and use it for different things because we had a ton of crawfish left over. So the next time I said, well, let me cut that number in half. So I went with, 75 pounds or whatever it was. It's an insane amount. And we still didn't sell a ton. So I think the third time finally I learned my lesson, and I did mostly shrimp and then a couple of crawfish. So it had that the view of a crawfish boil, but then the people were happier just to sit and eat the shrimp. And then they had the andouille and the potatoes and the corn and everything else with the boil. So it's kind of funny where the general public kept saying, we want crawfish boils. And then it didn't really turn out that way. They just wanted a boil. And we ended up doing much better with shrimp boils, which shrimp we have in excess. We use shrimp in almost everything. And so, and it's easier to work with because it's frozen, and the frozen product is great and easy to defrost and use. So yeah, it was just kind of a funny back and forth along that same vein. So
tell me a little bit more about your background specific, because I know you've obviously got cooking, you've got culinary, restaurants in your
a little bit
in your blood.
A little bit, in my blood, yes, but
in your blood. But you did not want to go into the industry originally. You went to college and didn't really know what you were doing. You ended up joining the Peace Corps.
Yep.
When did food and culinary start entering, your idea, your mind as hey, this could be something for me too, not just my family?
Well, so I did cook a little bit, and this was even prior to college. So when I left high school, I had a family friend that was the executive chef at Michael Jordan's restaurant in Chicago.
Wow. So
I was able to swing basically a summer internship where I got to see every facet of a kitchen. And Michael Jordan's at the time, this was 1999. So I think either he had just retired or somewhere in that, he was still really relevant.
At the height of his power.
It really was. And so Michael Jordan's at that time was, huge. I think that this location is closed now on 500 LaSalle. But at that time it was busy. And it was 3 levels. So one was like a sports bar on the main level. The second level was full on like steakhouse dining, like not fine dining, but close to fine dining. And then the third level was event space. So they had multiple kitchens. I mean, it was a giant operation. And I just remember like week 1 having to receive like 15 cases of chicken. And like people don't realize like how hot Chicago can get in the depths of summer. And then they always lose power. Their grid is really bad. And so whenever it gets too hot there, power goes out. So you're constantly struggling with power outages. And I'm sitting there with these 15 cases of chicken and there's just chicken juice everywhere all over the place. And I remember thinking that day, I'm like, this is awful. I don't want to do this. But then the rest of the summer was really cool where I got to learn almost every station and work the grill station and work this, that, and the other. So very early on, I was very interested in restaurants. Following that, even that summer internship, I went and I just went wild hair and I picked up a job cooking for hunters in Montana in an elk retreat. So I was off like 18 miles outside of Bozeman, Montana on horseback, cooking in the middle of the woods. And so there's a lot of these little things. So from very early age, I had that interest. And my uncle being in restaurants, that obviously was influential. My mom was a big cook as well as other family members. And so it's been something that's been part of my life for forever. The other half of my family that isn't restaurateurs is educators. Almost everybody else is an educator. And so my father, my mother, grandparents, aunt, I mean, literally a ton of people have been educators. So through college, I chose that path. So I went to college, maybe foolishly just focused on history and classical studies because of my own, interest in that. And so I was going to be a history teacher. But during college, I also decided that I didn't know exactly if I wanted to continue with schooling or go right into the workforce. And the Peace Corps presented itself as an opportunity to travel, which was also a big part of my life. And so the Peace Corps was a great opportunity. I spent 2 years in Romania. I'm still fluent in Romanian. I have friends in Romania as well as in Denver that are Romanian citizens but living in Denver that I converse with frequently. My best friend in the world, Mihai, lives in Denver. And so it's one of those that I had an amazing 2 years there. And then teaching English and helping with community service and things like that, which has been a huge part of my life for forever with my parents and my brother. But then coming out of the Peace Corps, I knew I didn't want to return home. And so I ended up convincing my family and another Peace Corps volunteer who had just finished. He was staying in the country because he had found a girl to stay with. And I convinced our 2 families to invest and buy a property. So this was my first, out there entrepreneurial experience. And so we purchased a cabin in the Carpathian Mountains at a ski resort. We renovated it by ourselves. We turned it into a little hostel. We had 18 beds to rent out. It was one of those, I don't know if I could. It sounds like a story I'm telling, and now like 20 plus years later, it feels like a story. Did it really happen or not? But, living in the mountains and skiing every day and accepting guests and, just all of the fun that went along with it. But then also too, learning about bureaucracy and licensing and everything. It was a little different there. Romania still functions on a quasi, you still have to kind of bribe certain officials to get things done. So it was a really interesting process of, well, I couldn't get this stamp today. And I'm telling my friends and they're like, well, what did you bring for the secretary? Well, what do you mean? What did I bring? Well, they're not going to get you past her if you don't bring her some chocolates or some flowers. And well, what did you get for the person who's going to give you the stamp? What do you mean? What did I get them? Well, you didn't get a bottle of whiskey or something to bring to the official. So you had to have gifts in tow if you wanted to actually get anything done. So not so much the way that it works in the United States, but very interesting learning process over there. So. And then when I came back to the States, the only thing I could fall back on at that time was the fact that I had degrees and I was aimed at, helping people, and I had been working with kids and educating. And I was actually working in California at a foster care system, and I found that really rewarding and fun. And when I came back to Omaha, I applied at Omaha Home for Boys and Boys Town, and I tried looking into educating at OPS or something like that. Nebraska does not recognize any of my teaching experience. 2 years worth of teaching experience, no recognition. Omaha Home for Boys and Boys Town, I think probably it was just culturally, it just wasn't going to be a fit, but Peace Corps, all of this stuff that I had done, and no acceptance letters there. So I was kind of stuck at 27 years old, like, oh my gosh, what do I do with my life? Because this isn't going to work out. I don't want to go back and get higher education to get recognition in Nebraska. And so I went and, fateful conversation with my uncle and said, what do I do? How do I get into restaurants? And, from that day, he's been my mentor ever since then, mentor and business partner eventually. But yeah, he guided me into restaurants, told me not to work for a local restaurant like his, because they have, their own particular way. They have, there's a lot of good, but there's also bad habits. He said the best way to go is go pick some, a corporation that you can have an actual training. They can teach you. They've got manuals. They've got ways to teach you
like
from
P.F.
the ground
Chang's.
up. So I went and I found P.F. Chang's, and actually I was just telling something, how our worlds connect or whatever. The original manager that hired me at P.F. Chang's, I sat there and I told him, all of my experience, and he's looking at me wild-eyed, like, what in the world? Who is this guy? And I said, but I want to learn how to work in restaurants, and eventually I want your job. And he looked at me and he says, well, I'd be stupid not to hire you, which in our world is unique. I think, he had a great outlook on it that, hey, this is a person that's willing to learn. They're willing to work hard. I'd be silly not to, because I think the reverse is so many people in our industry are so fearful for their job that they don't want to promote anybody. They don't want anybody to get better so that they take their job. But Rob had a great outlook on it, and he took the chance and, trained me up. Rob is the one who just opened, I think it's called, and we might have to edit this. What's it called? It's the cocktail bar on Leavenworth, True American. So he just opened True American with his wife. And so Rob, shout out to him. He's the first person that hired me into this industry, and he and I have been friendly ever since. And I've always respected him for the decision he made. I spent about a year at P.F. Chang's, training in all, from the bottom up. I jokingly say I was a 27-year-old busboy, bussing tables and wiping them down and just learning the fundamentals of service, and then moving into, server and, doing the takeout program at P.F. Chang's is a huge deal. Their takeouts are thousands of dollars a night, people call in takeouts. So that's actually a big role there. And that was a lot of fun to see how that works, working into service and bartending. And then I had it in my head that I wanted to be a manager, and quickly, and I got passed over for a promotion by a girl that had been there for a long time. And so I was out one night with a buddy, and again, how Omaha works, all these little tight-knit type deals. I was in Benson. I remember at the back patio at Jake's having a drink and bemoaning the fact that I didn't get promoted, and my buddy that I was sitting there with was Jeremy Hunter, who worked with my uncle for a long time at M's Pub. And he said, well, you want to be a manager in a restaurant? I said, yeah. And he said, well, my brother works out at Kona Grill, and he's the sous chef out there. Let me give him a call, because I think they have an opening. And within 2 days, I had an interview with Sally Stokes, the GM at the time. And within a week, I had accepted a position as an assistant manager. And Matt Hunter, coincidentally, is now one of my colleagues. He works for US Foods, and I've worked with Matt Hunter ever since. And he's a great guy and does great in our industry. So yeah, it's just weird how the world works. But then Kona Grill was really my big full-on training in operating restaurants. They had a great structure when it came to training. They invested a lot in managers at the time and making sure that they were fundamentally, aware of all operations. So, I got to be on calls with the CFO and the CEO of Kona Grill talking about, waste prevention and loss prevention, and, going through P&L management and all sorts of stuff. And so I really learned the nuts and bolts from my time at Kona Grill, and had a great management crew above me. Every single manager that worked there at that time was, fantastic in their field, and was able to give me a lot of knowledge and help me along the way. And then following that, I went to Bricks. So Bricks is now, it's been gone for quite a while, but I joined there. It was probably like, they were only open maybe 9 months when I joined Bricks. But I would say Bricks, you know, for what I got from Bricks, I was able to help develop the second location, and I was involved in the build out and the, you know, actually designing and helping figure out exactly how it was going to lay out. And so I think I gained a ton of experience from that as well on how to actually make a concept come to life. And so between those three, that's where I got the bulk of my knowledge or experience in restaurants.
And then you were able to team with, we've mentioned him several times, but Ron Sanderson, your uncle, longtime owner of M's Pub. I mean, just one of the probably most well-known Omaha restaurateurs. But like you said, he's a local restaurant. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm someone who is all local. I, you know, support local. But I have to admit, chain restaurants have their place, and they survive and they thrive because they have great structure, they have great processes that can be replicated. And there are a lot of ways in which local restaurants can learn from them. Yep. What are some things that you feel like you learned from in that corporate structure at those chain restaurants that have helped make some of your local restaurant adventures successful now? Yeah,
I would say, I mean, the biggest things are, you know, systems in general. I mean, that's kind of a broad category for restaurants, but it comes down to systems of training, systems of setting up the restaurant for success, systems in ordering, in cost management, and all of those things. I mean, there's so many processes that go into restaurants. I think, you know, at the end of the day, the general public, you know, and this gets talked about a lot, but I think the general public doesn't fully comprehend the amount of, you know, systems that are utilized every single day in every single restaurant, whether it be a small mom and pop all the way up to giant chain restaurants that are, you know, are serving, you know, $5-10 million a year. There are systems that have to be employed. And I think that's probably where some of the smaller places that if they don't have that training, that's where faults can come in with service or ordering or whatever it may be. And I think that's where, you know, I probably gained the best, you know, core experience for just actually operating a restaurant. How do we manage people, you know, from training to, schedule management, labor management, those things. How do we do that? Training, especially when it comes to guest service. I think that's, you know, when it comes to corporate culture, it's, you know, it's definitely that focus. You know, you can't go to a corporate restaurant without being greeted well, you know, and taken care of very well. I mean, that's generally a standard in any corporation. And I think that's where, you know, they definitely have an upper hand, is that they just absolutely force that down your throat that, you know, guest service is number one, you know. And so learning that firsthand, I think, was a great, you know, thing for my career and my understanding of restaurants. But then too, just the systems that are behind the scenes that people don't see, of, you know, waste and quality control and all of these things. I remember the chef at the time at Kona Grill, still, you know, friendly with Mark Quinteras. He was an absolute dynamo when it came to restaurants, and it was one of those that he worked with corporate Kona very closely on waste and cost management. And so if a menu item came down, it was, okay, we have to do all of these different items to make that menu item, and one of them is cutting vegetables a certain way, and it's got to be a certain length, and this, that, and the other. And I remember him one day, you know, they just did a menu changeover, and somebody had cut up a bunch of items, and he went and he looked at the pile of carrots that they had cut, and he said, "Those are great. They're wrong. So we're going to throw all those away, and we're going to do this correctly this time." And it was very, very calm like that. Very, you know, and this prep cook was like, "Okay, well, I guess I'm cutting carrots for the next hour," you know. But it was, because in the future we're going to cut so many carrots, and we got to make sure that they're all the exact same size, or however the specification was. And so, while I may not be that rigid in some of it, I think it still made me appreciate how, you know, there is this, you have to do things very intentionally, and you have to think about your costs very intentionally. You know, we can't just be giving away, you know, it seems like a quarter ounce or a half ounce of liquor, for instance. It seems like in that moment when you're giving that to a guest, like it's not that much. But when you multiply it out times the thousands of guests that are coming in, if we're doing that every single time, the amount of loss that's going into that is significant. And so that's, you know, again, that would probably be the second thing that I learned, especially from Kona Grill, just that loss prevention menu, how do we build a menu? How do we cost a menu? How do we make sure that it's done correctly and over time is replicated the same way? So I would say, how does that show up at Herbe Sainte? I would say in our, especially the bar, it's probably the easiest way to look. So many bars that, are more mom and pop, they don't use jiggers, measuring devices for their cocktails. It's free pouring is what we would call it. And, every drink is going to be a little bit different because everybody free pours a little bit differently. And so from day one, and we've never veered from this, our bartenders use measuring devices, jiggers, we call them. And then we have all of our recipes written down from the last 8 years. So any one of those recipes, if you dig it out of the woodwork and you go and try to make that cocktail, should taste exactly like it did 8 years ago, no matter who's making that cocktail. And so that's what I would say that's a very corporate minded way of thinking of, we've got this recipe, it should be exactly that way. And if it's not, we scrap it. And I'll do that in the middle of service on a Friday night. If I see a jambalaya that comes into the window that hasn't been quite cooked right, my wife just told me the other day, literally I'm using this as an example. She told me on last Wednesday, she threw away 2 jambalayas because they didn't look right. Those don't look right. Let's figure out what the problem is and let's get it right and make sure it's done the same way every time because we don't want a guest getting something that's not the same. So I would say those are probably the biggest things that I've learned from my corporate years. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've got this introduction to restaurants that is, in this corporate background. You've got family that has local ties. Mm-hmm. And I found a quote from you where you said, Herbe Sainte came out of nowhere. I don't think people realize that. Mm-hmm. So tell me, how did all these things come together? The idea for Herbe Sainte, your uncle, you working in corporate restaurants. How did all these things intersect to create Herbe Sainte?
Yeah, that's a long all the intersection points it's really long to get through. I'll try to summarize it the best I can. I had left my corporate jobs probably I don't remember a year or two before. I had just kind of gotten burned out. I was tired. And I think the biggest thing for my brother and I, especially at the time, was just the view that you can work so hard in restaurants and it's hard to get ahead. Like, what's the end goal, right? I think since the pandemic and probably that last 8 years, it not has gotten easier, but I think people have found avenues to create their own path. So you've seen that a lot in like food trucks, or you've seen that in smaller shops, around town where people are really able to get out and be creative and get a start. But at that time, 8 years ago, it just felt really daunting. Like, how do you get a start? And so when my brother and I were working together and we kept talking with my uncle about like, we'd like to have a shot, So really at that time, my uncle still being at M's Pub, he wasn't going to have the time necessarily to be spending with us creating a concept. And so really it was going to be Ron was going to help us get the introduction into being able to open a restaurant. And then my brother and I were going to run the restaurant. And so, we had a couple of different ideas that we eventually did happen and unfortunately are gone for various reasons. But our first concept that we all created was mode de vie. So that was our very first concept. It happened to be the third concept that opened. And it was just issues trying to get the space from the landlord. And so it just delayed our whole process. So in that time frame, we were looking at different spaces and we had a couple of different deals on the table that all fell through. And when this one deal fell through, we got a call from Nottle companies, from our landlord. And they said, hey, we hear you guys, a deal fell through that you were supposed to open. Do you want to come and look at a space that we have? And so we showed up as a group, my uncle, my brother, and I, and we saw what is now Herbe Sainte. And talking with, I believe Jay Nottle was there that day. And basically, he kind of said, here's what I'm thinking. The space that space, what it was supposed to be was the bar portion of a larger restaurant that would have wrapped where at that time was the yoga studio. So it would have been one giant restaurant, and our portion would have been like the entryway bar, and then in between would have been the patios, and then back where the yoga studio is, and now Saffron would have been the dining room. So he said, look, things happen. That restaurant didn't come to fruition. The yoga studio is there now, but I want a bar. I want a cocktail bar. And again, Herbe Sainte wasn't a even a concept in our head. It literally did not exist. And so he walked us through what he was thinking, cocktail first, decent wine list, and then maybe a little bit of food. And that was always the concept, was just a little bit of food. And so we literally spent the weekend, went to the drawing board and created Herbe Sainte, the very rough drawings of Herbe Sainte of what it would be and what it could be. And that was on a Friday that we saw it. By Monday, we presented it to Jay Noddle. By that following Friday, we had our letter of intent and everything on the space. And that would have been in March or April of 2016. And then we opened. So, basically no concept at all, March, April, somewhere in that time frame, contract to get it going by probably end of April. And then we had the space open and ready for business in October. So from nothing to something that fast. And, out of all of it, I would say, I've mentioned Noddle several times. It's been a great partnership. I mean, Noddle family now, because his son Sam and Aaron are both involved in the neighborhood. And we've had a ton of great success with the Noddles. They've been very, through the pandemic, through all of these different, issues and trials and tribulations, they've always been there as a partner to support us, help us figure out problems and how we can create the best solutions so that we can all move forward, and not have any issues with anybody having businesses or whatever fail. So I think, basically it was interesting that's how Herbe Sainte started, was with Jay Noddle just planting a little seed and saying, this is what I want to see. And then, to see what it is today, I think it's a pretty cool kind of circular story. So
it definitely is. And to bring something from concept to actual creation in a matter of months is just wild. I would love to get into that and unpack that more. I have so many more questions that I could ask you. We are running up against the clock a little bit, and there's one quote that I found from you that before we get out of here, I need you to unpack it, because I think it has the potential to be really fascinating and I think eye-opening for diners. This was a quote from Josh Fu's project that he did during the pandemic. Yeah. Right Here, Right Now is what it was called. And you had a lengthy spread in there, but there was one quote in particular that stood out to me. You said, "You build up almost as your superhuman caricature. You know this is who I am. You have a bigger-than-life mentality because that's what you have to do in this industry. You have to come in here, and you have to be part of the show, and you have to put on the show, and you have to interact with the guests. You have to bring your A game every time." Can you unpack that quote for me and how it's impacted your career in the industry?
Yeah, man, it's bringing back emotions. Josh Fu is a great friend, and he's
awesome guy. Love that dude.
Yeah, for Omaha and just in general, everything that he does with photography, but then also using his skill to then branch into the story of people in our industry, and he really tells those stories in just such a different way. I've always thought that Josh is just an amazing human being, and he's a better human being than he is at photography, if you can believe it. He'd be one. I don't know if you've talked with him or not, but
I have.
He's awesome. So, but yeah, basically, I think what we always look at is that it is like putting on a performance every night. It's almost like working in a play, and there's things going on behind the scenes that you don't see, which is so much like that, putting on a play every single night. But then the best twist is that it's not a play, it's real life, it's a restaurant, and really at the end of the day, we're throwing a party every single day. And so that's the way that we've always looked at it, is I get to wake up and try to throw a party every single day of my life. And it can be tiring and exhausting in a lot of aspects, but I think it's also what makes us, it's the drive that we have in us. It's what we love to do. And so, yeah, being part of that and having to have your A game and show up every day and throw that party, it's so that, the guests are having fun, enjoying themselves, wanting to come back, missing it, wanting more, whatever it may be, is all part of that. I would say, it probably gets a little bit harder as you get a little bit older. You get a little bit of years behind you, and it's like, oh man, I got to wake up and throw another party, but at the same time, I wouldn't trade in the last 8 years for anything, waking up and doing what I do and being able to be creative and work with people, and then, throw these parties and show people what we have to offer and all of the hard work that goes into it. I think it's what drives us. I would say at the end of the day, for me, and unpacking that quote, I mean, that's a 4-year-old quote. I mean, it's like I said, it's probably shifted a little bit. I think my personal enjoyment in our industry now falls a little bit more to the behind the scenes stuff. I love the creation of the restaurants. I love the setup and every day having to make sure that everything's just right. So when it gets running, then other people can come in and be that show person out front. So I'm probably a little bit less out front than I have been in the past. But it's really just, and it's not because I'm less present. I'm very present in my business, as anybody who works with me will tell you. Maybe too present, some will say. But my wife is still there helping to run the show. We've got a great general manager that's been with us for 7 years, Crystal. And so it's one of those that I think, everybody understands that we're not here if the guests aren't enjoying themselves. And in order to do that, we've got to be able to have that great, the outward, welcoming of the guests, the presentation of the food, the execution of the service, and the execution of coming out of the kitchen and the cocktails and that whole, everything that goes into it. So we're all very aware of that and work very hard and analyze it every day. Analyze people, that we work with, emotions. What are they going through? What can we help them with? How can we make them more comfortable in doing this or serving people better? So, it's just a constant, ever imposing, task to get done, because that's what we have to do to make people want to come back every day.
Well, you guys throw a heck of a party every day.
Well, I appreciate it.
Anybody who's been into Herbe Sainte can see that. They can, the cocktails are fantastic. You can taste it in the food. This is Cajun food unlike anywhere else you're going to find. Certainly in Omaha, I would posit even, Nebraska and even surrounding states. I'm not an expert in that by any means, but I think that you guys have created something really special, whether it was by accident or not. Yeah. You've done something great. And I just want to thank you, Justin, for this fantastic conversation. I think this might be the first episode of the podcast I've ever done without, mentioning a specific dish. The closest we got was the shrimp roll, and even that was just kind of in passing, or etouffee or something. But I think people get a sense for what Herbe Sainte is from this conversation, and also just kind of understand the life of a restaurateur a little bit better. So thank you so much for giving your time and
I appreciate the opportunity.
For giving your knowledge.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I was telling somebody the other day, I think, and this isn't to blow smoke by any means, Dan.
Oh boy.
But what I appreciate about you is that you have brought a very different way of promoting restaurants. You have brought a very genuine, heartfelt way of promoting restaurants. And it's clearly, when you are coming into somewhere, you are looking for the things to promote and find positive and push a restaurant in that really great positive way. And I was literally just telling somebody this the other day, that I think that you've been a great addition to our community. And again, I think it's every time I read it, I know it's going to be something positive and uplifting about a restaurant, because there are so many critics out there on that other side. And it's at a certain point, it's you can only handle so many critics, but you've come out with a really positive, uplifting light on restaurants. And I really do appreciate what you've contributed to our community. So,
oh, thank you. And people ask me all the time, they're like, do you ever have a bad meal? Of course I have bad meals. Yeah. I have bad dishes when I go out to restaurants, but I'm not, and I understand, I think food criticism has a place, has time and a place. That's not my time, my place, or my role.
Yeah.
I think my job is to shine a light on the things that restaurants do well, and the awesome stories that they have to tell, like yours today.
And the thing with food, too, is that it's such a subjective category.
What can be terrible for me could be somebody else's favorite dish. And who am I to tell them not to order it?
And that's what drives me crazy, is it's subjectively, you may not like it, which is different than it was bad. And that does happen. Things can be bad. Things can be executed poorly. But then what I would fall onto is, man, we're human. And there's going to be mistakes, and all I can do in my restaurant, and all my staff can be expected to do, is try their very best. If a mistake happens, it happens. How do we fix the mistake? That's the key. And so we really focus on what is the best way to fix it quickly, efficiently, make sure the guest is taken care of. We want you to leave thinking, man, they did everything they could. It didn't come out right at first, but you know what? They got it right when I brought it to their attention. So no, I think I love what you've done for, obviously your podcast and everything is great, but I do appreciate you and our community. So.
Of course.
Yeah.
And of course, it all comes down to the listeners and the people reading and watching and everything. Omaha, as always, thanks for eating with us.